So this is the first Sunday in Advent, and I've lit the first candle, the candle of hope. One candle burning in the darkness, and that will last this week, the first week of Advent, and then we'll move on to the second candle next Sunday. And meanwhile, I'm making a Christmas cake. So let's take a look at that recipe. I don't normally make Christmas cake, although it was a very important feature of my childhood. We always had Christmas cake at tea time on Christmas Day. Don't know quite how we managed because we'd already had a big Christmas dinner, but it was part of the tradition that we had of eating Christmas cake and some leftover mince pies and opening our presents. That is, we had our Christmas tree ceremony at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Very English habit. Don't normally make the cake because I live alone and mince pies and Christmas pudding are quite enough. I'm making it this year probably for 12th night, so you could call it a 12th cake, and that's also traditional. So right now I have about 850 grams of mixed fruit, same kind of fruit that goes into mincemeat and into Christmas pudding. That is raisins, sultanas, crystallized fruits, and right now the fruits are sitting in brandy, and they have been for several days and probably will continue for several days. Unlike with the pudding, where you marinate the fruit for one day and then you go on to make the pudding, for Christmas cake you can afford to marinate for a good deal longer, and it just makes everything richer and more complex. Spices are going to be about the same: cinnamon, cloves, allspice, ginger, nutmeg, mace, the usual culprits. And I will get on with making the batter for this and baking it probably tomorrow. I'm not sure yet. One of the reasons I don't make Christmas cake so much here in Asia is that I can't get marzipan, and until this year I couldn't make it because I couldn't get almond flour or grind almonds properly. I did try one year and my food processor just didn't do the job, but right now I've got almond flour, so I'm going to make marzipan to coat the cake, and I'll probably make it in 12th night fashion, as I'll probably coat it with marzipan and add marzipan balls around the outside. Not sure yet, just starting the process. So here's step one: marinate the fruit. Now, towards the end of the process, I'm adding some maraschino cherries because I like the taste of them in the pudding and in the cake, not in mincemeat. Mincemeat we'll talk about later. I like apples as an addition, But for the cake as well as the pudding, maraschino cherries, and I've got quite a lot here. I've got to take the stems off and I'm going to put them in a hole and just let them sit in the brandy along with the other fruit for another day, and then we'll prepare the cake batter. This is the latest stage of the cake. You see the cherries are in there now, and you can also notice that I've added some spices. Usual Christmas spices, allspice, cloves, mace, nutmeg, cinnamon, ginger, and the recipes usually say a teaspoon of each or something like that, but I always add more, and you're going to have to gauge it yourself. And now I'm going to start adding some different ingredients, but I'm going to do it in a way that is unusual for making a cake. That is, I'm going to melt about 220 grams of flour, and I'm going to add some of this mixture into it, and then I'm going to put it back in the pot and let it cool. It kind of reminds me of making slack pastry, where normally you have everything very, very cold to make slack pastry, but normal pastry, but for slack pastry you boil the lard. Well, here I'm going to melt some butter, and the butter is over here, and I'm going to melt it and add some of the fruit, and then I'm going to put it back and let it cool. Now this step takes the place of the normal creaming. I'm also going to add around 150 grams of brown sugar, and I'm going to then just simmer them all together for a few minutes. All right, you can see the sugar's added. I'm going to give it a bit of a stir now, and then I'm going to put it back in its pot to cool. So you can see it's all stirred together, and I don't want this to go for too long. It's just to make sure that the sugar is all melted and incorporated into it. So it's the equivalent of creaming, but in a very different way. Now I'm going to turn the heat off, and I'm going to just let it cool on the stove for a little bit and then put it back in the pot. And next step, probably in about an hour or so when things have nicely cooled, is I'm going to add the other ingredients, which will include flour and eggs and some nuts, and then we'll be ready for baking. And meanwhile, I'll show you how to line the cake tin and prepare for baking. So the mixture is now cooled, and I've added 100 grams of ground almonds. So all told, I'm getting pretty close to a kilo of fruit and nuts. The fruit probably weighed, all told, about 850 grams, and this is about 100 grams of slivered almonds. And this is going to be a heavy cake. It's not going to be like the fruit cakes in the US that everybody makes fun of because they don't like them, but because there's not much fruit in it. It's mostly cake with some fruit dotted around. This is like pudding. It's fruit that is just barely bound together by a batter. So the next, I'm going to zest 1 lemon and 1 orange, and then I'm going to add my dry ingredients and some eggs, and then we'll be ready for baking. And meanwhile, I'll show you how to line the cake tin. So sometime in the process you have to prepare your pan. Now I don't have a proper cake pan. I've been looking all over the place for one. I can't find one. So I use this very heavy earthenware round casserole as my cake pan normally. And for Christmas pudding it actually does very well because it's very thick, and so it's going to distribute the heat evenly, which is what you want, because Christmas cake cooks at a fairly low temperature for a very long time, and you really don't want it to burn, so that you need even distribution because it's thick. I mean, the cake is thick, and you want to cook it all the way to the center without burning the outside, which is very difficult. So first step, liberally butter the pan and then line it with parchment, baking parchment. Sometimes people use 2 layers. I'm just going to use 1. And you need to cut out a circle for the bottom, and then the walls, and you need to have them rise above the rim of the cake pan. And I'll show you how that looks next. So you can see I've cut a circle of parchment for the bottom, pressed it down into the greased pan, and then greased the parchment on top as well. You really want to make sure that you're going to be able to get the parchment cleanly off the cake once you have finished baking. Now you can see that I've made the sides kind of like walls, and they're also greased, and my next step is to finish the batter, preheat the oven, and then off we go to the races. Alright, so now we have the zest and the juice of 1 orange and 1 lemon. Now for the dry ingredients, 100 grams of almond flour, and then I'm going to add about 150 grams of all-purpose flour and 4 eggs, and then beat up the batter. So here's the almond flour first, and here's the flour, 150 grams. Right now the mixture is too liquid, but by the time I've incorporated the flour it will be a little bit more like the pudding, a little bit firmer, and I'll have to just see once I've mixed this together, because I've got to add the eggs next and I don't want it to be too thin. So the flour incorporated really nicely. It's quite thick batter now, and I'm going to add the eggs. It's 4 eggs beaten. I'm going to mix this together and then bake. My oven is preheating right now, and I'll show you before I put it in the oven. The mixture is nice and brown, and I want it to come out really dark, almost black, and it's looking pretty good right now. Now this very last step of combining everything all together is very much like the puddings, that you have to really stir hard. This is very dense, very heavy, and you have to make sure that all the ingredients are fully incorporated. Took a little bit of time to get the eggs mixed in, but that's all looking very good. Now I'm going to pack up the cake into the cake pan. Now you'll notice that there's no baking soda, there's no rising powder in this, or no agent that's going to do anything to make it rise, because it's a dense cake. It's like Christmas pudding. In fact, you could even think of it as being baked Christmas pudding rather than boiled Christmas pudding. I'm not going to do the decorating after I've prepared this cake and baked it until Epiphany probably, so you have to wait for that, because I'm going to make some marzipan and probably some royal icing. We'll have to see, but that's the essence of a really wonderful fruit cake for Christmas, is that it has a marzipan layer, and an icing layer. Really, really sweet. Generally too sweet for me, but for Christmas I have a tendency to go over the top. Now the batter is in the pan, and you can see why you need the walls of parchment, because it's right up to the very top of my pan. And I've smoothed off the top, although I'm actually going to use the bottom as the top when I decorate, and I trim off the bottom to make it flat. And it's going to rise a little bit anyway, and so I'll have to do some adjustment once it's baked. But now I'm going to put it in the oven at 125 degrees Celsius for 2.5 hours. So about 2.5 hours later, here's the cake, and I've cut the parchment paper down a little bit because I'm going to turn this out once it's cooled. It's still cooling right now. See, I've poked a few holes, and I've also drizzled a little bit of brandy on the cake, and they just go into the holes. And I'll keep doing that every 2 weeks until Epiphany. This cake can keep for a very, very long time. The brandy is just like the brandy on the pudding, but I'm not soaking it in it. I want to keep the cake basically dry because I'm going to put marzipan around it. But just drizzle a little bit in, and now I'm going to let it cool, and then I'll show it turned out, and then I'm going to put it in an airtight container and just let it mature. So I didn't let the cake cool in its pan absolutely completely. I did let it still be a little bit warm, because that meant that the butter around the outside would still be melted. And inverted a big platter and turned it over. It's very heavy, very difficult. But there it is. You can see it's nicely brown, dark, almost black. And I'm going to put it in an airtight container in a cool place, and then just keep it that way. A little bit of brandy on it now and again until right around Epiphany. I could use it for Christmas, but the thing is, I've got mince pies and I've got pudding already very sweet. May even make a Christmas bomb like I did last year. So there's enough sweet stuff. I'm all on my own. I'm not going to be able to eat all of that. And then this comes up for Epiphany. Probably going to end up keeping most of it for a year. Could even slice it horizontally in two. I'm not sure yet. But anyway, this is the cake that I used to love as a boy, and I will make some marzipan next in early January, and I'll show you how to do that and how to decorate the cake. So for now, have a great week, and on Friday I'm going to go back to my talking about the unpacking of Christmas. And meanwhile, please tell your friends, please like, please subscribe, and I will see you on Friday.